You know, after reading the Eidolon class feature, I just have this feeling that there was a Paizo staffer that went to Build-A-Bear as a kid and thought, this could be so much cooler. Hey, that's a really fun character concept. Today we're going to do part 2 of our discussion of the Summoner class by talking about the Eidolon on today's episode of the Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the Local Disaster Tour Guide. That's right, I am a storyteller who really wishes that Paizo would give us an Aberration Eidolon because I really want to adventure with Cthulhu. This can't possibly backfire. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder, and welcome back to part 2 of Classic Introductions to the Summoner, where we're talking about the Summoner class for Pathfinder 2e. Classic Introductions is a series where we examine different classes in TTRPGs and ask what do they offer at the gaming table. We've been working through the various offerings in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and recently we've come to Secrets of Magic and the Summoner class. And for the first time in this entire series, we have landed on a class that was complex enough where I actually felt like the best way to explain this class or approach this class was to divide it into 2 parts. You see, the Summoner in Pathfinder 2e is the premier pet class where you have a magical bond with a creature known as an Eidolon, and your character works in tandem with that Eidolon to pursue their goals. Effectively, the Summoner class ends up feeling like 2 separate characters that are working together as part of a singular build, and because of that I ended up splitting the discussion of the Summoner into those 2 distinctive parts. In part 1 of this series we discussed the Summoner themselves, and if you haven't seen that video yet, I'll throw a link up here. I strongly recommend checking out part 1 of this series before moving on to this video, just so you have the proper context for many of the things we're going to be discussing here. But in part 2 of this series, we're going to be looking very closely at the critical feature of the Summoner class, that magical creature that you are bonded to, known as your Eidolon. We will be using the exact same 7 questions that were used in part 1 of this series to examine the Eidolon, and the goal in this video is to dive into what the Eidolon represents for the character and for the class, and hopefully to help us understand how to get the most out of this particular aspect of the Summoner class. Now, when it comes to the Classic Introduction series, these videos are the most complex videos in terms of research, scripting, recording, and editing. So, if you enjoy this content, I would really appreciate it if you would do some of that YouTube stuff that helps support the channel. You can like the video, share the video. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe to the channel. And you can check out my free Discord and my Patreon, both of which will be linked in the video description. However, far and away the best thing you can do for this channel, and the thing that I appreciate the most, is you can join in the conversation. Jump down to the comments section, leave your thoughts, your observations, your ideas about how to use the Eidolon and get the most out of them. I love to hear what you all have to say, and I always feel like I've learned something from the feedback I get from this community. But with all that out of the way, let's get started. Now, for the first question in this series, we want to ask, what is the class role of the Summoner, or more particular to this video, what is the class role of the Eidolon? Now, in the previous video, we talked about how the Summoner and the Eidolon are a bonded pair of creatures that each plays a different role, but that when taken together serves a greater whole than either of them would apart. In the last video, we talked about the fact that the summoner themselves is the spellcaster half of the equation, so today we're going to move over to the Eidolon, and while most people would discuss the Eidolon as a pet, and that's a fair comparison, honestly and truthfully, if you look at the Eidolon just kind of in isolation, the Eidolon is basically a martial character in Pathfinder 2e. Seriously, just add up the details. 10 plus Constitution modifier hit points per level. Master Fortitude and Will saves. Master Defense. Master Attacks. The basic stats of the Eidolon, if you look at them in a vacuum, it's the proficiency skeleton you would expect of a martial class, such as a champion, a ranger, a rogue, or a monk. In fact, the Eidolon is such an overwhelming part of the Summoner's class kit, you can almost consider the Eidolon to actually be the main character and the Summoner to be the support for that character, meaning in some ways the Summoner class is a martial class that just has a caster backup that follows them everywhere they go. While there is a lot of variety that we will get into when we talk about the different Eidolons, just the basic structure of what the Eidolon is and how the Eidolon functions, the easiest comparison is you can consider the Eidolon to be a martial character and to play that combat-oriented role inside of Pathfinder 2e. Now for our second question, we like to ask how complex is the Summoner, or in this case Eidolon, as an option for players? And, well, the answer's not going to change from part 1 of this video. I give the Summoner and Eidolon duo an overall complexity rating of 9 out of 10. There's a lot of homework with this class, there's a lot of things you got to think about. You are essentially managing 2 different characters. I still think it's very doable. I have seen brand new players for Pathfinder 2e play a Summoner and Eidolon and do it well, but this is a class that's going to have some extra work to it, and that's something you want to be prepared for. Everything we said in the previous video remains true. I will say that when it comes to playing an Eidolon, that having a really good sense of focus on what you want your Eidolon to be is going to help. There is such a wide variety of options that if you come into the Summoner-Eidolon combo blind, you might get overwhelmed, but if you have a good focus beforehand, it's going to help you cut through the various options and pick out what is right for you. But now we can move on to key terms and concepts for playing an Eidolon. In the previous video, we discussed a lot of the things that are appropriate to the Summoner half of this class, including the tandem keyword that Paizo highlights in that key terms sidebar. But today we're going to move to the concepts that are a little more focused on the Eidolon themselves. We're going to start with an ability called Manifest Eidolon. This is a 3-action activity that allows the Summoner to call the Eidolon into existence, and then the Eidolon gets to hang out with them and go on adventures. There is nothing in the ability that says you have to use this ability during combat, which means that for the most part, 3-action activity is not that big a deal. The odds are your Summoner is probably going to have their Eidolon out and in play before initiative is ever rolled. Still, if for some reason your Eidolon is not present when initiative is rolled, 3 actions brings your ally into the fight and they're ready to roll. When the Eidolon appears, there is a magical symbol that appears on the Summoner and the Eidolon that allows any intelligent creature to immediately notice that there is a mystical connection between these 2 individuals. Nothing can hide this symbol. It doesn't matter if you wear a mask or other clothes, you can't put armor on and try to hide this symbol. This symbol is a manifestation of the magical connection between the Summoner and the Eidolon, and so long as the Eidolon exists, everybody around is very clear of exactly who that Eidolon is working for. But let's get into some of the fun details here. The Eidolon comes with 2 specific key terms that are highlighted in that key terms sidebar by Paizo, and those are the Eidolon key term and the evolution key term. Now the Eidolon key term is pretty straightforward. Basically it means can be used by an Eidolon. Not that difficult. However, there is a little bit of a bigger picture here, so let's step back a second and talk about it. An Eidolon typically is not going to be proficient in any particular item or gear, and most of the items and gear that is available to the summoner is not available to the Eidolon. In order for an Eidolon to use a particular piece of gear, it must have the Eidolon trait, which designates that it's something that an Eidolon can actually use. On top of that, Eidolons cannot connect to gear nearly as well as the summoner can. Where the summoner can invest in the normal amount of magical items, an Eidolon can invest in a maximum of 2 magical items at any given time. Now there are some exceptions we'll discuss in a minute, but in terms of Eidolon-specific gear, at best they're going to have 2 active. The other trait that's worth mentioning is the evolution trait, which for the most part is a description you're going to see on summoner class feats. At basically every level a class feat is available, you're going to see at least one, if not several options that have the evolution trait, and basically what it means is this particular class feat is going to change some aspect of the Eidolon. The options here are honestly all over the place. One feat may add extra attacks to your Eidolon, or give your Eidolon some sort of energy damage to their attacks. Another feat might increase their size or give them a unique movement speed, and there are a lot of evolution feats that modify some of the rules surrounding Eidolons. For example, most Eidolons do not have the ability to cast spells, but there are a line of evolution feats that will give your Eidolon access to a small number of spells that they can use during play. So for the most part, when you see that word evolution show up, you can just kind of tag it and say, this means that it's changing something about my Eidolon. That's what this class feat does. However, there is a small extra layer to the concept of evolution class feats that is worth discussing. You can retrain evolution feats. A summoner is magically bonded to their Eidolon, and that magical bond allows the Eidolon to come into existence, and as a result of that magical bond, the features and capabilities of the Eidolon can and do change, meaning that evolution feats are retrainable. Retraining is a set of rules you can find in the core rulebook, and you can totally retrain evolution feats, but there is an important distinction. If you retrain an evolution feat, you must retrain into a different evolution feat. So, for example, you could train out of Bloodletting Claws and into the evolution feat that gives you energy damage, but you couldn't retrain out of Bloodletting Claws into a class feat that gives the summoner a new link spell. If you retrain an evolution feat, it must specifically retrain into another evolution feat. Now, in the previous video, we did mention several of the things that are important to know about the summoner and the Eidolon and how they work together. For example, one of the big things is the summoner and Eidolon, they share a pool of hit points and a pool of actions. But I want to dig just a little bit deeper for a moment and talk about some of the niche moments in the rules and how those interact with the Eidolon. For example, what happens if the summoner and the Eidolon are both hit by a slow spell? Well, anytime that a summoner or the Eidolon would be affected by something, basically what happens is you just take the worst of the 2 outcomes. So if the summoner is slowed 1 and the Eidolon is slowed 2, you don't lose 3 actions total. Instead, at the start of your turn, you're just slowed 2. There is an important distinction on this point that is worth noting. The summoner is the anchor of the bond between the summoner and the Eidolon, meaning that if there's ever a dispute between the 2, the summoner wins out in terms of what actions are performed. Ergo, if the Eidolon is ever hit with a condition like confused or controlled, the summoner does have the option to not give any actions to the Eidolon, effectively shutting those conditions down. Obviously, there are a lot of small, nuanced rules about interactions between the summoner and the Eidolon, but those are some of the big general principles that you want to remember. The last thing I want to discuss on key terms and concepts is the idea of gear. Now, I did mention earlier that the Eidolon can only invest in 2 pieces of gear that have the Eidolon trait. That is true. However, the Eidolon can benefit from certain gear that the summoner is invested in. And basically this boils down to 3 categories. If the summoner has a piece of gear that improves their perception, the Eidolon also benefits. Next, if the summoner is wearing armor, any fundamental or property runes on that summoner's armor will also apply to the Eidolon. And finally, if the summoner is invested in a weapon or hand wraps of mighty blows, the fundamental and property runes on that weapon or hand wraps will apply to the Eidolon as well. It is worth noting that if you're using a weapon and giving those benefits to the Eidolon, the summoner must be actively wielding the weapon in order for those benefits to transfer. But just as a quick summary, if the summoner has gear that is improving their perception, or armor or weapons featuring fundamental or property runes, those benefits will transfer over to the Eidolon without needing extra separate items to make that available. But okay, we're past the key terms and concepts. Let's get into some of the more entertaining parts of the conversation and talk about the strengths of the Eidolon. Now, I already mentioned back in the class roles section that you can kind of look at the Eidolon as a martial character. The base statistics really reinforce that role. You've got the hit points and the raw offense and defense that you would associate with a martial character on your Eidolon, meaning that the Eidolon functions as a pretty effective beat stick inside a fight. Now, with that said, the base stats of the Eidolon are generic martial. And that's an important starting point for this conversation. A ranger, a rogue, a barbarian, those classes are not just effective in combat because of their baseline proficiencies. It is the other abilities of the class that really define why those classes are effective. And when you look at the Eidolon, it's important to remember that you have the baseline stats of a martial character, but the Eidolon doesn't come with those extra class features you would expect from other martial characters. What the Eidolon is bringing with them is their own dedicated support caster. You are a martial character who has a caster at your beck and call every single fight. It's amazing. Essentially what this boils down to is the Eidolon is one of the most versatile martial characters in the game. Depending on the summoner's spell choices and the evolution feats that you've picked, your Eidolon can potentially be tiny, small, medium, large, or huge. Its main attack can deal potentially any type of normal physical damage, and then you can have basically any type of elemental damage stacked on top of that through the use of your class feats. Different choices inside the game may allow your Eidolon to debuff enemies or add extra damage. There's just an incredible assortment of what an Eidolon can do, and here's the cool thing about the Eidolon. A lot of that can switch from fight to fight. The link spells or the link cantrips that your summoner is using, those can switch around your stats for a fight and change some of the specifics of what the Eidolon is capable of. Yes, there are certain parts of the Eidolon that are relatively locked in day to day, but the Eidolon is one of the most versatile martial characters inside of the game, and if you want to experience a martial character that can respond to just about any situation, the Eidolon can literally be custom built for that. So the key strength of the Eidolon is definitely the versatility that it brings to bear. However, there is another kind of sneaky strength of the Eidolon that is worth mentioning, in that it's resistant to some of the most devastating debuffs in the game. Remember earlier I mentioned that the summoner can just cut off the Eidolon's actions if it is confused or controlled? That's a pretty good emergency switch. The evil villain takes control of your party's pet dragon, and the summoner just says no and stops that before it gets out of hand. The Eidolon comes at first level with a pretty sweet emergency shutoff switch that can really undermine some of the most devastating effects that might come your way during the course of a game. But what about the Eidolon's weaknesses? You are this incredibly versatile martial character that can adapt to this incredible array of possible situations on the battlefield. What weaknesses does the Eidolon come with? And the answer is squishy McCasterface that you've got to be responsible for because he's a cloth caster with basically no spells. The Eidolon is on a permanent escort quest. That's what I'm saying. Okay, so I know I'm being a little silly and I'm exaggerating a bit here, but one of the important things to realize is any damage that is done to your support caster hits you as the Eidolon. And something that we talked about in part 1 of this series is they don't have the defenses, they don't have the armor, they don't have the same ability to resist incoming hostile effects that the Eidolon does, which means a smart enemy knows that if they take down the summoner, they take down you. Now, this is probably going to be a somewhat rare situation. If an enemy caster managed to control the Eidolon, the summoner can effectively shut that condition down and ignore that potentially very extreme situation. Well, there's a flip side to that. A smart enemy caster, if they can find a way to confuse or control your summoner, that smart enemy caster can shut the Eidolon down very quickly. This is a very short road to removing one of the most powerful assets for your party completely from the table. So essentially what I'm saying here, the Eidolon is versatile, it's powerful, it can hold its own in a fight, it's got a lot of things going for it, but it is important to remember that when you are playing a summoner, you have to balance the squishy caster and the powerful beat stick of an Eidolon, and you have to make sure you are keeping both safe, or you could very quickly lose access to both members of this incredible team. Of course, now we get to move on to question number 6, which is what are the subclass or build options that the summoner class gives me, and in this case our Eidolon is the subclass options. The specific type of creature that the summoner is bonded to determines an incredible amount of how a given summoner character is going to play. In particular, there are 11 different Eidolon options presently available in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, 10 are available in Secrets of Magic, and an 11th was added in Book of the Dead. And when you pick one of these options, it's going to do several things for your build. As we talked about in part 1 of this series, the Eidolon that you choose will determine the summoner's spellcasting tradition or spell list that they get to use, and it will also give the summoner 2 particular trained skills. One of these skills will always be a spellcasting skill, and then the other skill typically tends to be a charisma-based skill of some kind, though there are a couple of variations from this theme. Additionally, every Eidolon that you can choose is going to come with 3 different specific abilities that it can learn. The first ability unlocks at 1st level, with the second ability coming at 7th level, and the final ability showing up at 17th level, meaning that you have a pretty good wait before you unlock all of the abilities that the Eidolon can use. A final thing worth noting is, for every variation of Eidolon that you can choose, there are actually 2 different stat arrays that the Eidolon can start with. Basically, for these stat arrays, you can look at them as a strength-based Eidolon and a dex-based Eidolon. They'll have different flavor text for each version, but that strength and dex divide is kind of what you're looking at no matter which version of the Eidolon you're going with. Also, each version of the Eidolon is going to give you some suggested natural attacks that the Eidolon could use. This is mostly a flavor thing to help you pick something out quickly, but any Eidolon can choose any of the available legal starting natural attacks. They just have recommended ones there to help you go through that selection process a little quicker. Those are not mandatory. Now, diving into every single Eidolon and every single Eidolon ability would take forever, and this is part 2 of an already incredibly long conversation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a big picture look at the different Eidolons available to help you understand kind of the role that each Eidolon is intended for. Though, as I have noted earlier, there is so much flexibility to this class that obviously you can play around with these particular ideas. Let's start with the Arcane Tradition Eidolons, which are the Construct and the Dragon Eidolons. The Construct Eidolon represents a bond with a golem or some other mechanical beast that the summoner is able to conjure into existence. The Construct Eidolon is going to give the summoner training in the Arcana and Crafting skills, and this is one of the few Eidolons that doesn't have a Charisma-based skill as their automatic ability. And a lot of the abilities of the Construct Eidolon revolve around essentially making crafting checks to rapidly switch out the abilities that your Construct Eidolon has, meaning that the Construct Eidolon is essentially intended to be the flexible option inside of the game. As for the Dragon Eidolon, the name tells you what you're going to get. You have a pet dragon. This is going to give you the Arcana and Intimidation skill. In the previous video, I noted that Intimidation is all over the place. We're going to see it a lot here. But it gives you Arcana and Intimidation, and then essentially you have a pet dragon that is going to very much fight the way a dragon would fight. It's going to have a breath weapon. It's going to have a Draconic Frenzy ability. And if you've ever wanted your own mobile weapons platform of a dragon, well, that is exactly what this Eidolon gives you. The next tradition worth discussing is the Occult Tradition Eidolons, and as of right now, both of the Eidolons under this tradition are phantoms, which are not quite ghosts, but rather spirits that are tied to your summoner in one fashion or another, and these phantoms are defined by a particular emotion that drives them. Right now there are two options, anger and devotion. Anger is going to give you Intimidation and Occultism as your class skills, and this probably will not surprise you, a lot of the anger phantom abilities revolve around rage-like mechanics, meaning that the anger phantom Eidolon kind of ends up playing like you've got an extra barbarian on your team. Meanwhile, the devotion phantom Eidolon is a much more defensive-oriented Eidolon. This one's going to give the summoner access to the medicine and occultism skills, so here we see a second choice that actually steps out from charisma skills, giving you medicine instead. But the devotion phantom ends up playing a lot more like a champion, with a lot of defensive abilities designed to keep their summoner alive. Our next tradition is the Primal Tradition, which is going to have three different Eidolon options: the Beast, the Fae, and the Plant. The Beast is going to give the summoner access to the Intimidation and Nature skills, and in a lot of ways, the Beast Eidolon just really feels like an Animal Companion Plus. If you've seen what an Animal Companion can do for a Druid or a Ranger, well, you're kind of getting that with just a little bit more stacked on top when you look at the Beast Eidolon. Up next is the Fae Eidolon, which gives the summoner access to Deception and Nature, and this is probably one of the most unique Eidolon options, because this one actually leans directly into the Eidolon as a spellcaster, which is something most Eidolons can't do without significant class feat investment. I actually feel like the Fae Eidolon ends up playing somewhat like a sorcerer, or maybe a low-grade magus. I might be stretching that just a little bit, but essentially the Fae Eidolon is the most magically oriented option presently available in the game. Finally, you have the Plant Eidolon, where your summoner has a bond with a powerful magical plant, and that plant allows the summoner to be trained in the nature and survival skills. Now I will say, the Plant Eidolon is one of those that I initially overlooked, but when I saw some of the online commentary, I realized the potential around this Eidolon. The plant comes with a lot of battlefield control mechanics, allowing you to just kind of plop this plant in the middle of the fight and make it really, really difficult for enemies to get places and do what they want to do. It's not necessarily the most aggressive Eidolon, but it could be really fun if you like giving your enemies headaches. As for the last tradition, the Divine Tradition, this is the tradition that currently has the most Eidolon options available, with 4 distinct options that are currently available. 3 of them can be found in Secrets of Magic, and that is the Angel Eidolon, the Demon Eidolon, and the Psychopomp Eidolon. And then a 4th Divine Tradition Eidolon, the Undead Eidolon, was added in Book of the Dead. Now, really quick on skills, all 4 of these are going to give you Religion as a class skill, and then the Demon, the Psychopomp, and the Undead Eidolon will give you Intimidation, because Intimidation is all over the place with this class. The Angel Eidolon is the only unique one in this area, in that it gives you Diplomacy and Religion instead of Intimidation and Religion. As for how these 4 Eidolons play, honestly they're very similar to each other. They all end up kind of feeling like champions. The Angel Eidolon obviously would lean more towards a good aligned champion. The Demon Eidolon would obviously lean more towards an evil aligned champion. and the Psychopomp Eidolon kind of feels like a champion that took the oath against undead. But at the end of the day, the divine flavor of all of these options really just leaves you feeling like your Eidolon is functioning in a role very similar to a champion. And then the Undead Eidolon got added to the game, and basically it's the best tanking Eidolon in the entire game, which again, kind of feels like a champion. Essentially what I'm saying is, the Divine Eidolons all end up feeling like they're really strong for defensive play, which is actually a pretty good fit for Divine Tradition magic, so I think that particular build concept makes a lot of sense. But alright, with all of that out of the way, let's talk about our last question: how can I get the most out of the Eidolon? Well, there's an obvious thing we need to acknowledge right out of the gate, which is every single Eidolon is going to have a different answer. An Anchor Phantom is going to play in a fashion similar to a Barbarian, whereas a Plant Eidolon is going to be more focused on battlefield control and preventing enemies from freely moving around the battlefield. So the particular choices that are going to be best for each Eidolon are honestly going to change. So a large part of this question is honestly just knowing this is what my Eidolon is built around, and then identifying which particular options or choices are going to best support that. Now, in the previous video, we did talk about a large part of that is actually going to be the summoner half of this class. For example, as I've noted, the Undead Eidolon is easily the best tanking option for the different Eidolon choices, meaning that if you're playing a summoner with an Undead Eidolon, you probably want to pick up the Reinforce Eidolon Link cantrip, because that is a really strong tanking cantrip that can just kind of push what the Undead Eidolon already does to an even greater extent. So step one of answering this question is understanding what your Eidolon does, and then step two is identifying what is the best fit for that particular approach. However, there is one thing on the Eidolon that I think is very important to understand, and this is incredibly easy to overlook. That is, retraining exists. Now, I know I say this in a lot of the Classic Introductions videos, but one of the best things in Pathfinder 2e is core retraining rules. The fact that retraining is a core part of the game, it is an expected part of the game, that is something players should take advantage of, but especially with a class like Summoner, when you're investing in evolution feats, that feels like it's a permanent part of the class. It's not. You may remember earlier I noted, evolution feats can be retrained as long as you retrain into other evolution feats. Are you going to be going up against monsters that are weak to fire or cold? Well, you can retrain into the appropriate evolution feats that make your Eidolon a lot more effective against those particular creatures. Are you high level and anticipating a lot of flying foes? Well, there's literally an evolution feat for that. You can retrain into it when you need it, and then retrain out when something else is more appropriate. Retraining is a powerful tool in Pathfinder 2e, and the Eidolon is intended to be one of the most versatile martial characters in the game. If you want to get some real mileage out of that versatility, retraining is just a critical thing that you don't want to overlook. Of course, the final point worth mentioning here is something we already discussed in part 1 of this video, which is a large part of getting the most out of the Eidolon is actually the question of getting the most out of the Summoner and Eidolon in tandem. Every fight scene is going to be a little bit different, and figuring out the best position for the Summoner and the Eidolon, or figuring out the best tactics for the Summoner or Eidolon, is always going to require some active thought and management. There may be turns where you need to lean very heavily into what the Summoner can do and leave the Eidolon to the side. Conversely, there may be turns where the Summoner is not going to add much at all, but the Eidolon is going to take up the majority of the turn. And obviously there will be turns where there's more of a balance between the two, but as a player you want to keep that balance in mind and ask which of these two can I better optimize in this specific situation. But with that, we have finally come to the end of the Classic Introduction Summoners 2-part video series. We've talked about the Summoner and today the Eidolon, and now we've had a look at the whole of what the class has to offer. So let me turn the conversation over to you and ask, what are your thoughts, in this case specifically, about the Eidolon? Do you agree with my assessment, Or are there aspects of the Eidolon that I have overlooked? Do you have some advice for how to get the most out of the Eidolon in play? Well, if so, jump down to the comments section and let me know your thoughts, ideas, and suggestions. I genuinely learn a lot from this community, and I look forward to what you have to say. Don't forget all of the other YouTube stuff. Like, share, subscribe, check out Discord and Patreon. But, as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.